So welcome to the first part of the tutorial on quadratics. Now quadratics is the foundation of algebra at A level. An inability of working with quadratic algebra will be the first sign that you will struggle at higher level maths. In this video I will go through what prior knowledge you will need, an explanation of key vocabulary and a summary of how to solve quadratics. So here is a list of prior knowledge that you will most likely not be covered in your A-level classes, but something that you should be carrying forward from your GCSE classes. So the first thing you should be able to do is be able to factorise and solve a basic quadratic equation. And when I say a basic quadratic equation, that's where you've got a single x squared. You also should be able to solve a quadratic using the quadratic formula when it's in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. You also need to be able to factorise a quadratic equation when you have got more than one x squared in your equation. Now there are several ways in which you're able to do this, in which I will do another video on how to factorise a complex quadratic equation. You also need to be aware of when you plot a quadratic equation, it's going to form a parabola, either positive or negative, so you need to appreciate that it's going to be either a U shape or a what we call an N shape. You also need to be able to know that when we talk about the root of a quadratic equation, then that refers to where your parabola crosses the x-axis. So just labelling it there. And also recognise that sometimes the roots are also known as the solutions to your equation. Continuing from that, if we just move on to some of the vocabulary notation that you should be able to know. So when you see the word factorise, that just simply means put into brackets. Roots, as I've mentioned, is when your quadratic equation is relating to a graph. It is where the curve crosses the x-axis. The solution is, so when you've got a quadratic that doesn't refer to a graph, then the solution would be the values of x that make it equal to 0. The vertex of a quadratic equation is basically the max and minimum point of your quadratic curve. So for example, if I had a positive parabola or a positive quadratic equation, then the vertex would be this point here. If I had a negative parabola, then it would be this point here. The coefficient is the quantity of a variable in an expression or the equation. So for example, what is meant by that is if I make up a quadratic equation, so let's go for 3x squared plus 4x minus 6, then the coefficient of x squared would be 3, the coefficient of x would be positive 4, and the constant would be minus 6. So if you relate it to ax squared plus bx plus c, then your coefficient values are a, b and c. And one thing to bear in mind is obviously the sign of both a, b and c, to make sure you include it when you are talking about the coefficients. And finally, an identity, which is basically means when something can be written algebraically in the form of. Now this will tend to come up more when it comes to proof, when you cover that topic, but obviously it sometimes is related to quadratic equations, particularly when you're doing completing the square. So what I'm going to go over now is just how we go about solving quadratics and a bit of a refresh based on what you would have done at GCSE level. So before solving a quadratic, the most important rule that you need to remember is that you've got to make sure that it is equal to 0 first. Now at GCSE level you probably would have got a mark by rearranging it to make it equal to 0 if it wasn't already, but at A level you're going to be expected to do this without very little reward. Now in terms of factorise, so there are several ways in which we can solve a quadratic equation. One of the first point of call should always be trying to factorise it first. Now there are several ways in which we can go about factorising. There is factorising we're using double brackets, clearly. There is complex double brackets where you've got where your coefficient of x squared is going to be more than 1. There is a difference of two squares, completing the squares, which is quite prominent at A level, and there is complex completing the square, and again this is where you have got where your coefficient of x squared is more than 1. Now The other way of solving a quadratic is by using the quadratic formula, and again you can do this on your calculator. Again, first of all, making sure it's equal to 0, writing down the coefficients of x squared, x and the constant, substituting into the formula, and away you go with your two values. And the last and final way of solving a quadratic is by plotting it. Now this is probably the least favourable one and probably least recommended, however sometimes there is a need for it. So to solve a quadratic equation graphically, you make it equal to 0, replace 0 for y, plots. So for example, what we mean by this, if I just go through an example, is if you wanted to solve x squared plus 3x minus 5, then what we would do is we'd make it equal to y. We would go about plotting this onto a graph and using a table of values, and where your answers would be where your curve crosses the x axis, so it would be where these two values here are.